really, I think no better way to cap off the day than to hear from Brad Crabtree. Brad is the Assistant Secretary for the Department of Energy's Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. He leads and directs FECM's research and development programs and oversees the Office of Petroleum Reserves. Brad's familiar to many of you from his previous role as Vice President for Carbon Management at the Great Plains Institute, where he co-founded and directed the Carbon Capture Coalition. I've been with the Institute and working on carbon capture for about 6.5 years, and Brad is one of the first guys that I met when I came here, and he had a smile on his face then. He's got a smile on his face now. He warmly welcomed me, and I've really admired what he's been able to achieve ever since. So, Brad, it's a great pleasure to have you with us here today. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Jeff. I really appreciate that, and it's great to be with you here today, and welcome to the folks online. I know many of you in this room, have worked with many of you, and I was thinking about these remarks and the time, and thinking, it's both an honor but also a challenge to follow individuals such as Vicki Alb of Occidental, who I believe is one of the most important industry leaders in the world today, really. And Jonathan Pershing, who is one of our great analysts and diplomats on climate and energy. And then we've got on the agenda today advocates like Simone Stewart, Cecile Conroy, Jeff Brown, who are working day in and day out to advance policies and projects that we need to meet our climate obligations. And there's many more of you in the room and online that I can't recognize. And then I also just I was here this morning and I heard Vicki's remarks and the Secretary's, and I just really want to emphasize the importance I felt of Secretary Granholm's remarks. She delivered a passionate and compelling speech about the climate necessity of carbon management, but also the jobs and environmental opportunities it presents. And President Biden has made carbon management, he's the first president in the United States to make carbon management a pillar of his administration's climate strategy. And I felt the Secretary's remarks really reflected that commitment. And then Jared, a special thank you to you and Jeff and others on the GCSI team for a great event, for all that you do, not only in the United States but globally. And as you mentioned, we've been working together for years, and I only hope that continues. And I most of all appreciate the commitment, the global commitment you have to really helping carbon management realize its full potential. I just want to take a few minutes and actually take stock of everything that's been accomplished, and including things before this administration. Think about how far we've come, but also then to end a little bit with highlighting the carbon management opportunities that are contained in the bipartisan infrastructure law that passed last year. As the recent IPCC report underscores, it's been talked about today, it's going to take an all-hands-on-deck approach to meeting not only the Paris targets, but also President Biden's goals of 50% reduction by 2030, net zero in the zero emissions in the power sector by 2035, and net zero economy-wide by 2050. Central to this challenge, and you all know this, is achieving economy-wide deployment of carbon management. And it has to be across the value chain: carbon capture, direct air capture, carbon conversion, and of course the build-out of CO2 transport and infrastructure and storage infrastructure. The Secretary noted this morning that the IEA has put the near-term target for deployment at 1.5 billion metric tons of capture and storage by 2030, or nearly 30 times where we're at today. Until recently, we simply didn't have even the beginnings of a policy framework that will allow us to achieve this challenge. Thanks to many of you in this room, we have started to change that. The first step, and this is part of the taking stock and actually taking a moment to realize, what we've gotten done in the last few years. The first step was the years-long effort finally culminating in 2018 with the bipartisan reform and expansion of the 45Q tax credit. It happened at a very challenging political time in this country, and the Secretary made the point that you have the most conservative members of Congress all the way to the most progressive members supporting carbon management. This legislation, it was the epitome of that, arguably unprecedented in the history of energy and climate policy in this country. The result already has been to spur in the marketplace nearly 100 carbon management projects that are at least publicly announced. Not all of them will happen, but that's an extraordinary response to an incentive. 45Q reform was followed by several years of work in Congress on a bipartisan basis to start to develop the authorities and the programs for beefing up U.S. research, development, demonstration, and deployment funds, again, focused on carbon management technologies and infrastructure. Many individual bills were introduced over that several-year time period. And then there was an extraordinary effort led by the energy committees and supported tirelessly by bipartisan Senate staff in particular to pull all these bills together in what became the Energy Act. Again, much to everyone's surprise, at a very politically difficult time, passed it in December of 2020. We were all very excited, but truth be told, there wasn't any money in it to speak of. It was the authorizations, but not the appropriations. And then fast forward one more year to, I want to get this right, yes, November of 2021, and the President signed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, now commonly called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill. And that provided the funding. It obviously is a massive legislation that spans the entire economy, but there's $62 billion that are going to the Department of Energy over a 5-year period for all things energy and climate. And within that is $12.1 billion for carbon management technologies and infrastructure. It is the largest investment to date in the world from a national government in carbon management. It's an historic accomplishment, and importantly, it's a bipartisan accomplishment. And it's a credit to advocates like yourselves and members of Congress and others who made the effort over, frankly, many years to build what became the foundation of that legislation. So what does this mean in terms of the pipeline of things coming forward now in the Department of Energy? You take this $12.1 billion, and I'm going to tick through the major things. It's late in the day. I won't go into great detail. There could be a lot said about these individual provisions, but I'll give you the highlights. The Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management is now working to ramp up a $2.5 billion expansion of our existing carbon safe program to develop large-scale regional saline geologic storage sites, storage hubs across the country, each of which will be required to store at least 50 million tons of CO2. And also, as part of the selection, they'll be expected to serve multiple facilities and industries. So really creating an integrated network. In parallel, the DOE loan program is laying the groundwork for the Carbon Dioxide Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Program. We call it CIFIA for obvious reasons. It's an over $2 billion program. It includes low-interest loans and grants. The grants are intended to help pay for extra capacity up front so that these pipelines and other infrastructure are built ahead of demand. Some of you in the room were involved in the development of the SCALE Act, was the original bipartisan bill that was rolled into the infrastructure bill. And that was in itself was an extraordinary effort. Thanks to these vital provisions, we can start to build out the regional CO2 transport and storage networks that are necessary to bring the deployment of carbon capture, direct air capture, and carbon conversion to what is truly climate scale. The bipartisan infrastructure bill also transforms R&D as we've commonly understood it. When I first started working on carbon capture in 2002, by 2003, I was hearing presentations about the Valley of Death, where we were doing a tremendous job in the United States and in other countries supporting the development of technologies from basic science to earlier stages of research and development. And then it was expected that the private sector would then take over and magically bring these technologies to the marketplace. That might work with iPhones, but it doesn't necessarily work with billion-dollar carbon capture retrofits. And so what the infrastructure bill does is it takes that R&D continuum truly to the third D, research, development, and commercial demonstration. And so there's work underway at DOE right now across multiple offices at the department for 6 commercial scale carbon capture demonstrations, 2 for coal-fired power generation, 2 for natural gas-fired power, and 2 for industrial facilities. On top of that, there's an $8 billion hydrogen hubs provision. Who hasn't heard of the hydrogen hubs at this point? That will feature at least one regional hub that will demonstrate clean hydrogen production at commercial scale using natural gas with carbon capture and storage. So you think about the 6 demos, the hydrogen hubs provision, and a whole range of other technology demonstrations, many outside of carbon management that are in the infrastructure bill. And DOE, in response to this, is standing up what's called the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, a new part of the department to oversee the new commercial scale emphasis that takes us past conventional R&D. At the same time, the department is hiring almost 1,000 new employees to permanent positions that will be part of what we're calling a new clean energy core. And then finally, to ensure the next generation of capture technologies makes its way through the development pipeline and ultimately into the marketplace to benefit industries across the economy, the infrastructure bill provides our office with $1 billion to invest in large-scale pilot demonstration projects. So these are prior to pre-commercial scale. The exciting thing about this $1 billion is it's not limited to a particular technology or industry. So it allows some strategic emphasis on what's most needed to move things towards the marketplace and get them ready for commercial scale demonstration. And then to top it all off, a few weeks ago, the team at FECM released a notice of intent for the $3.25 billion investment in regional direct air capture hubs. Each of these 4 regional hubs will capture and store CO2 from ambient air on a scale of 1 million metric tons per year. This is the single largest federal investment ever made in direct air capture research, development, and demonstration. And the goal is really to build a new industry. So, this is the top line overview. I could go into more detail, I won't. And it's an extraordinary portfolio of climate investments in the realm of carbon management. But as Secretary Granholm emphasized this morning, it's about more than just meeting our climate obligations. It's about improving people's lives in the communities they live in. So in keeping with President Biden's commitment to environmental justice, as the Secretary said, we're making sure that DOE invests in carbon management projects that deliver significant environmental benefits to disadvantaged communities that have been disproportionately impacted by pollution, many for generations. Fortunately, carbon capture and carbon conversion technologies can help reduce some of these key environmental pollutants beyond just CO2 emissions. And we're going to be engaging affected communities and incorporate their views in the decision-making process as projects are designed and developed to make sure that these local communities benefit. The carbon management funding in the infrastructure legislation also provides an opportunity to retain and create high-quality jobs that pay above prevailing wages and support middle-class families and communities. One of the benefits of carbon management is that you're retooling existing industries, facilities, and infrastructure. You're allowing people to stay in their livelihoods and to participate in the decarbonization of these industries. It's a way to do right by American workers who have supplied our energy needs and sustained our nation's industries for generations. And finally, and this is a bit of the call to action, there's more work to be done. The Secretary mentioned, and although I wasn't able to be here in the afternoon, I have to imagine it's been discussed, and I know my friend Jeff Brown surely talked about direct pay for the 45Q tax credit, right? If not, you let me down, Jeff. Right now in Congress, critical enhancements to the 45Q tax credit are being negotiated. These include increasing the credit value for direct air capture, for capture from power plants and industrial facilities and storing that CO2 in saline formations, as well as storing that CO2 through enhanced oil recovery, and providing those payments at the directly at the full value of the tax credit. Again, so companies don't have to monetize that tax credit. They can claim it as a payment on their tax return. Very, very powerful change to that tax credit as well as others that are being considered. And then finally, extending the tax credit for 10 years. That would help close all of these provisions together, would help close the remaining cost gaps that we all know exist for carbon capture technologies and infrastructure. And equally importantly, they would provide a much longer time frame for development and investment, a longer time horizon for these projects, so that we really can put the industry on a runway towards net zero. All of these things taken together, the infrastructure bill investments, enhancements to the 45Q tax credit, together would be transformative. In particular, the tax credits will pull in the private capital to leverage against these investments that I just outlined in the infrastructure bill. Our friends at the Clean Air Task Force, they commissioned some analysis last year. They called on the Rhodium Group to look at the infrastructure bill and the key carbon management provisions and these core 45Q enhancements, and asked what would be the deployment implications of the tax credits being paired up with the infrastructure bill. And they estimate that the potential for 210 to 250 million tons annually in carbon capture and storage capacity in the United States by 2035. So up the upper end, a quarter of a gigaton potentially. It's very exciting. So concluding, you know, obviously, these are really profoundly difficult and uncertain times that we're navigating today. There's the ongoing economic, energy security, and supply chain crises we're facing. All of this has been exacerbated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Yet, as the Secretary stressed, and I suspect that many of you stressed today, we still have to stay the course on climate. In fact, many of the things that we need to do to address these challenges in the world today will be aided by decarbonization. So that's why it's all hands on deck at the Department of Energy to implement the infrastructure bill. And as the Secretary emphasized, we look forward to partnering with all of you to harness the transformative potential of this legislation. You know, I tell people every day, when I go to work, I feel like this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. There are so few times in politics and in public life when so many things come together, such as they did in this legislation. And it's incumbent upon all of us to make the most of this opportunity for the future. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you.